I got one or two buddies, but they're always going somewhere else different already. They're already, one guy special, he's always doing plays and everything else.
Do you want the mic?
I think you guys can hear me. Good evening and welcome to the closing reception for Changing America, the Emancipation Proclamation 1863, the March on Washington 1963. This exhibit is presented by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Museum of American History. It's in collaboration with the American Library Association's Public Programs Office, and the exhibit is made possible through the National Endowment for the Humanities, which happens to be celebrating their 50th birthday this year. It's part of the endowment's Bridging Cultures initiative, Created Equal, which encourages communities across the country to reflect on the long history of civil rights. I would like to thank the Independence Historical Museum and Art Center for partnering with the library on hosting this exhibit. Without them, we would not have received this amazing exhibit for our community. And I would also like to thank you, the community, for coming out and supporting these humanities programs. The president of the museum would like to say a couple things about some upcoming programs they have real quick.
No, that's fine. I think I can get along with that tonight. Thank you for being here. Whether two or more of us are together, that's power. So I want to just compliment Brandon for doing outstanding work with this project. He wrote the grant and has managed it and just done a wonderful job, and we're very grateful to have him in this community. I'd like him to stick around, but I know he's kind of eager to leave. And on behalf of the museum, I want to say how pleased we are that we can partner with the Independence Public Library for a number of activities. This is not the first, and it's not the last. Starting October 6th, we open the Hometown Teams, a bat and a ball. It deals with the history of baseball and independence and how it impacted the community and vice versa. And it's another collaborative effort with the Independence Public Library. So we're excited about that. A week from tonight, if you have an opportunity, we're going to have a little bit of fun and throw pies on some faces and have apple pie and do kind of a crazy kickoff for that particular event. So glad that you folks could be here. And please forgive me, I'm double booked tonight, so I'll be in and out a little bit. So I'll beg your forgiveness. So well done, Brandon.
Thank you. Your program tonight is 1964, the Civil Rights Act, the War on Poverty, and Freedom Summer. Our program is brought to you by the Kansas Humanities Council, a nonprofit organization promoting understanding of the history and ideas that shape our lives and strengthen our sense of community. Our presenter this evening is Dr. Gretchen Cassel Eick, a professor emeritus of history at Friends University in Wichita. In 2009, she was awarded the Friends Excellence in Teaching Award. Her scholarly work has been on the civil rights movement, the 1950s through the 1970s, and on Native American history. Her first book, Dissent in Wichita, The Civil Rights Movement in the Midwest, 1954 to 1972, won 3 awards and stimulated others in Wichita to examine this history, resulting in curriculum materials she developed, a public television documentary, 2 museum exhibits, and 2 commemorations of participants in the 1958 Dockum Drug Store sit-in, the first successful student-led sit-in. CBS and CSPAN both featured this part of Kansas history in 2011 and 2012. She currently writes novels and short stories. Gretchen joined the KHC Speakers Bureau in 2010. Please welcome Gretchen.
Okay, you need to tell me if I need the mic. I mean, I can use the mic because is it better if I use the mic? Okay, let's do it then. I'm really glad you're here, and if I'm blocking your way, and if you can imagine how glad I am you're here, because I drove 2.5 hours to come here to speak to you tonight, so I'm really glad that you all came. I'm going to look at 1964, especially through looking at the summer of 1964. Can you see the screen? Okay, all right. So what you're seeing here is a map of what state? Mississippi. And you see all the counties, and then you see areas that are numbered, 5 different areas of Mississippi. And that's because in the summer of 1964, about 1,000 young people, predominantly whites but also quite a few blacks, joined African Americans who were already working in Mississippi. About 1,000 people left their college campuses in June and went to Mississippi to spend their summer registering voters and doing other community service work in Mississippi. Now, before that, I mean, that may just, to me, it's always just, it stuns me to think about that, 1,000 people. And I always have wished that I had been one of them, and I didn't have the courage to do that. But okay, so first of all, they went to the most violent state in the United States, the most brutal state in the United States, and I'll give you some data on that in just a minute. Let's go to the next slide. Mississippi had responded to the desegregation order by the Supreme Court in 1954, the Brown case that came out of 5 different states, including Kansas, including Topeka. Mississippi had responded to the Supreme Court's order to desegregate schools, to stop legally separating people according to race in schools, by establishing the White Citizens Council, which had branches all the way across the state. It was basically, they also set up several other organizations, including what was basically a KGB, or a secret police network, which was called the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission. And it was headed by the governor, and it used state tax money. So as we think about where we are today in Kansas, I mean, anything like this is still possible. You know, it could still happen again. This was Mississippi, not Kansas, but it is possible for states to do this. They initiated what was essentially a reign of terror. They burned churches, they killed people who were involved registering voters and supporting civil rights for all people. They burned crosses, they beat people up. I will read you some description from a book that I wrote that just came out a month ago about this period. And it was a very, very nasty time. There were 30 people who lost their lives, who were martyrs, just in Mississippi, just during this period of the civil rights movement. Okay, let's go on. And part of the story that's really neglected a lot is this Freedom Summer when the students came south. Part of the reason it's neglected is that there was a lot of the material, the records that they kept were destroyed. They had offices in various towns across Mississippi, and the Klan or the Citizens Council, because the Klan will also start up again in Mississippi in 1964. And they would go in and they would firebomb the offices, and people would be forced to just run for their lives. And of course, all their records, all the lists of all these people that had been working in registering voters are all destroyed. We had young people in the South doing this from 1961. And I don't know if any of you have read, there's a superb book that was written by Ann Moody, Coming of Age in Mississippi. It used to be used at Harvard in most of their history classes. I think now they aren't using it so much but like 10 years ago they were using it in all the American history classes at Harvard. Moody was a Mississippi girl who was working registering voters. She'd gone to Tougaloo College, and then she dropped out and started registering voters. And then she was so mentally undone by what she experienced. I mean, it was so bad that you would be taken, if you were registering voters, you would live with somebody in the community. Sharecroppers would open their homes and bring you in. And it would get so violent that you would have to go out and sleep outside during the summer nights. And this is Mississippi. Think the heat of Mississippi. Think the mosquitoes of Mississippi. And it was kind of a joke the volunteers would say to each other. I don't know whether the violence of the Sovereignty Commission and all these groups is worse than the mosquitoes. It's like they're both pretty bad to try to deal with. There are other books about this. John Lewis, Congressman Lewis, who you have, if you pay much attention to the news in Washington, he's been on quite a bit as we've remembered the civil rights movement in the last few years, the 50-year anniversary of this and the 50-year anniversary of that. John Lewis was also, he was from Nashville, Tennessee, and he was a young divinity student who was very involved. He wrote a book. It's a wonderful, wonderful, very enlightening and very encouraging book called Walking with the Wind. There are others whose names are here, and we'll look at some of those in a minute. central person in Mississippi Summer was a man by the name of Robert Moses, and you see him there. He was a PhD candidate at Harvard, and he dropped out and went to Mississippi because he felt that it was really important. He'd been teaching in New York public schools, and he felt that it was just really important to do this work. And when he went to Mississippi, he saw something that a lot of people forget, which was one of the true learnings of the Civil Rights Movement. He saw that people, no matter how poor, no matter how uneducated, people know what they need. And instead of telling them what they need, work with them and ask them to identify what they need, and then give them the tools to go get what they need. So this quote, leadership is there in the people. You don't have to worry about where your leaders are, how we're going to get some leaders. Leadership is there. If you go out and work with your people, the leadership will emerge. And that's what Bob Moses was known for. And here he is with 1,000 college kids. A lot of them white, a lot of them used to thinking they had the answers, right? I mean, that's what a lot of people think when they're in college, right? I've got the answers, I know what's this. And Bob Moses had to train them to stop thinking from their own position of privilege in society and their assumptions, and start asking and listening. And that was quite a task. But he did it, and he did it masterfully. Many African Americans were being murdered, and I said 30 people. According to John Dittmer's book on Mississippi, 30 people died, were martyred. There were people like Emmett Till. Whoa, this is really, that's all right, it's okay. I just want Troy to stop me if I start telling you. Emmett Till, who was 14, was murdered in 1955, and 2 black men were murdered in the weeks before. The 14-year-old Till was murdered. Till was murdered because he came down from Chicago and he whistled at a white woman, or said, there are 2 different stories, and either he said, or he said, hi baby, he's from Chicago, you know, he's kind of thinks he's a cool 14-year-old boy. And the woman was married to, and her husband and her husband's brother came that night and took Till away from his grandfather and castrated him, beat him, terribly beat him, and tied an engine to him and dropped him in the river. And his body was eventually found, and his mother had an open casket funeral because she said, my only child is not going to be sacrificed without the world knowing what they did to him. And that every black person I've interviewed about 80 people for this book, Dissent in Wichita, which is a study of the civil rights movement in the Midwest. Every young black person remembers where they were the day they heard about Emmett Till. It was like Trayvon Martin has had that thing in more recent times. But there are a lot of people who remember where they were when they heard that story, because it felt like I'm not safe. Okay. That's what it means. Herbert Lee was murdered by a white man that he played with as a child. They'd been good buddies as kids. That was in 1961. Medgar Evers, who was the head of the Mississippi State NAACP, and a veteran, come home from the Korean War. And when he was driving home one day, the same day that Kennedy gave a television address where Kennedy said he was going to ask for a civil rights bill, right after Kennedy made that speech, as Evers got out of his car and walked up his driveway, he was gunned down. Then there was Lewis Allen, who witnessed a murder of one black man, Herbert Lee, and then told the FBI that he needed federal protection because he was sure they would come after him. The FBI said no, and he was shot dead in 1964 in his driveway. So what are they up against, these 1,000 volunteers, these young people who are really believing that there is a cause of equality, of freedom, that the Declaration of Independence means it, when it says all people are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, they're up against a system that is very, very well organized. For example, the Imperial Wizard of the KKK, which formed in 1964, that same summer, the Imperial Wizard was a man named Sam Bowers, who was a Sunday school teacher, who was a veteran from World War II, who was profoundly anti-communist, and who was college educated, who loved swastikas, and who was never punished for the murders he ordered except for one. And that was much, much later. We'll see at the end of the presentation. But he would say, okay, take him out, take her out, take him out. And those people would go missing and their bodies would later be found. He ordered those murders. And he got away with it. And upstanding member of his church, right? Hi, come and join us. Okay, let's go to the next. Even before the summer of 1964, there were rallies in the Mississippi Delta, which is a predominantly African-American area where cotton is grown. 10,000 people had come out to hear Thurgood Marshall, who would become the first African-American on the Supreme Court of the United States. There had been other civil rights activity before these 1,000 students came. There had been picketing at Woolworths in '63, sit-ins in Jackson, the state capitol, at the library. 300 had been arrested at the end of the summer of 1961. When Evers, the state director, was killed, the people showed up at his funeral in mass, and there were 30 people arrested at his funeral. Bob Moses took Herb Allen's widow and Fannie Lou Hamer and another farmer whose home was firebombed up to Washington, D.C. to testify when 100 college professors would not respond to his invitation to go to Mississippi and see for themselves how badly, how violent the situation was there. So he took these folks from the Delta sharecroppers, took them to Washington, D.C. to meet with professors to tell their stories and say, this is really what's going on. You have to understand what's going on. We are protesting, but the violence is unbelievable. Okay, they had formed, the civil rights groups had formed a group called COFO, which was a coalition of civil rights groups. The ones on the top, CORE plus SNCC plus SCLC equal COFO, the COFO. They had formed that in 1961. And Bob Moses had gone to Mississippi to register voters, leaving his PhD program at Harvard to do so. And they had to make a couple of decisions from the get-go. Were they going to allow people who volunteered in Mississippi to carry guns? Big decision. We hear a lot of this in Kansas right now. We already heard the decision in Kansas. He said, no, you may not carry guns. Even though everybody's armed out here, you may not have guns if you're a volunteer working to register voters. Are we going to have blacks only working in Mississippi? Or are we going to invite blacks and whites together to work in Mississippi? It's a very dangerous situation if you invite blacks and whites to work together, because it violated Mississippi's strongest code of racial separation. But they made the decision they would invite these white college students to join them. And there were rules if you came to volunteer. You had to be home before dark, never be alone, anywhere alone in Mississippi. And if you're followed by a car or cars, drive as fast as necessary, at 100 miles per hour down a dirt road if necessary, to get away from the cars pursuing you. It is unsafe to stop, because you will probably end up dead. They had to do things like tape the interior lights. Now you all remember how there's a light, I have an 18-year-old, I drive an 18-year-old car, so my car has the interior light and there's a button. They taped those buttons down. That was one of the first rules. They had old junky cars and taped the buttons down so that when you open the car door, the light will not go on. My car's been like that for about 10 years. But they did that deliberately so that people would not be able to see who is in these cars or be able to see where to aim their guns. The danger is impossible to exaggerate. I will read you something in a few minutes that I have a friend who was part of Mississippi, the Freedom Summer in Mississippi, and when I finished this novel, I sent it to him. I dedicated it to him and I sent it to him. And what he wrote back was, he said, when you talk about life in Freedom Summer, and this novel is not just about Freedom Summer, but that's part of it. He said, you really haven't. I thought you'd actually been there because you really have named how bad it was. Okay, by March and April of 1964, Bob Moses and the others had a plan. They would invite blacks and whites to work together, college students, in Mississippi for the summer of '64. They would have them register black voters, because we're talking about counties that are 90% black, right? And if you don't have any black people who can vote, or you have 6% or 6.7% only registered to vote, if you could only get people registered to vote, they could protect themselves. They could get people into office who cared about what's happening in these communities. They would start freedom schools to teach U.S. history, to teach black history, to teach what are your rights under the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, and also to teach reading, writing, and math. They would form community centers, kind of like this. I mean, they take whatever space is available, and they have programs going, job training, literacy training for adults, all kinds of, whatever skills were needed would be done there. And they would usually have a library. Like you have one, I guess, across the street, but their library would be in the community center. And people from up north would send boxes and boxes of books down. And the other plan that they had was, we have to find a way to get into politics, to get have some political voice. Mississippi was a 99.9% Democratic Party state. All of the South was. There were no Republicans. Remember Lincoln was elected president without being on the ballot in 11 southern states. I mean, there was no Republican Party in the South, except a few people who were persecuted for being Republicans. I mean, that was a long-standing tradition. This was the solidly Democratic South. So African Americans would go to the Democratic Party meetings and they would be told, no, no. And they would not be told in nice language, but they would be told, no, no, you are not allowed. So they decided they had to form an integrated political party, Democratic Party. They called it the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And that would be part of what they would do in Mississippi this summer with all these young people coming. Okay, time to leave to come south. Those who volunteered went to a college in Oxford, Ohio to be trained, and a women's school. And they had their training, they were told how dangerous it was, they were told many times that if you don't think you can do this, you need to back out. We don't want you to go, because this is not a picnic. This is not going to the Caribbean or going to Cancun, for your summer vacation. This is dangerous stuff. And it became very real to them when the day before they were to leave, they got word that 3 of the volunteers who had already gone to Mississippi were missing. It became very frightening. Okay. So some of the things, let's see, actually, I don't want you to have to read all. Oh, well, this is some of some more things that were done to them. They would be harassed by beatings with tire irons or baseball bats. They would get night visits from people, and they would be whipped with rubber hoses. Public facilities like libraries and pools were closed to them. There would be a $400 fee if you were caught speeding. Now, remember I said if you're out on the roads, you're supposed to speed like crazy to get away from folks? So if you do that, you get a $500 fee for speeding, a $250 fine for reckless driving, and $500 for trespassing, and your car is probably impounded, and you have to pay for that. So you're upwards of well over $1,000 to get this piece of junk that's the only car you have to do your work back from you, if you survive. Simultaneous cross burnings. One night there were 100 crosses burned in Mississippi towns where these volunteers were working. They made it illegal for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to meet. They arrested people and sent them to Parchment Prison. If you remember the film from years ago, that George Clooney was in, the Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Anybody remember that? That was filmed in Parchment Prison. So that's where the volunteers would get. Come on, come and join us. That's where the volunteers would be sent. Their offices were dynamited, and black businesses were dynamited, and specific people, Dan Bowers would say, exterminate that person. They're providing all too much leadership. So this is what they're up against. Next one. Okay, so in Mississippi in 1964, there were only 6.7% of the African American population who were registered to vote. Now, compare that with other southern states. Tennessee had 69%, Texas 58%, Georgia 44%. Is Mississippi much worse or just a little bit worse? What do you think? What's your guess? If only 6.7% African Americans can vote in Mississippi versus, well, Georgia it's 44, right? Which is the worst situation? Everybody? Mississippi, right? And nearly half the population of Mississippi was African American. So when we're denying the right to vote to half the population, this is a very serious issue. Then add on top of that all the violence. Okay, let's go on. I don't want to take time at all to read. This is Bob Moses talking to these volunteers. And you can see they're black and white, they're young, and they come from all over the United States. They are like from 17 years on up to, say, 23. But pretty much in that arc of age group. And they're giving up their whole summer, putting themselves in incredible danger to work here in Mississippi, registering voters, setting up community centers, setting up the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Okay. I said that before the first big group arrived, word came that these 3 young men were missing. Andrew Goodman, 20, James Chaney in the middle, 21, Mickey Schwerner, one of the older volunteers at 24. He was already married. And when they went missing, nobody knew what happened to them. They'd gone to investigate the burning of a church, arson of a church in a rural area, and they had just never come back. And Bob Moses and the other people who were leading Freedom Summer were pretty sure that they were dead. They had to be dead. If you didn't come back, because if you were going to be late, you had to let somebody know, because they knew that the chances were you would be killed. President Lyndon Johnson sent sailors into Mississippi to try to search for their bodies. Malcolm X offered protection to the sailors so that they would be able to, Malcolm X offered protection to people to be able to go and try to look for their bodies in this very dangerous state. And the Justice Department had 24 suits against the state of Mississippi for voter discrimination, for not allowing people to vote. Andrew Goodman had been in Mississippi for 1 day when he disappeared. 1 day. The 3 of them drove from Philadelphia to Neshoba County, and if you can see the arrow on this side is pointing to Philadelphia, Mississippi, and they drove to investigate a church bombing, and they were in Greenwood, which is the other arrow is pointing down to Greenwood, and that was going to be the site of their first voter registration drive, and then they disappeared. Dick Gregory, anybody know Dick Gregory? Who he is? He was a comedian, an African-American comedian, very funny guy, and in the 60s. And he personally put up a $25,000 reward to find these 3 young men. Okay. And by the way, go back just 12 things. That's all right, we can do the next one. You can go to this. If you notice all those little stars, all the stars are freedom schools. All the X's in a little box are voter registration sites. And the other little icon is for planned community centers. So they are active all through Mississippi. A second group of volunteers arrived, and because everybody was scared, you have a situation where these early young men have been absconded and killed. They're welcomed by two people, both African American, both consider themselves African American, Vernon Delaware and Fannie Lou Hamer. Mrs. Hamer was a sharecropper who had decided that it was time to claim her right to vote. And when she claimed her right to vote, she was arrested and beaten very badly. She was thrown off her farm, out of the house that she was provided, lost her job, and she decided, rather than be frightened by that was going to make her determined to do whatever she could to change the situation in Mississippi. And if you go online and look her up and listen on YouTube to some of her singing, she was an incredible singer, and she had a way of she was very charismatic. She had a way of bringing these youth who were scared to death to be in Mississippi doing this work, bringing them out of themselves to trust that it was going to be okay. They were doing important work. And she would just start singing, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around, etc., etc. We're gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, walk into the freedom land, and let her voices fill the room, and people would be just amazed. This picture of her is at the end of the summer when she goes to Washington, D.C. and testifies to Congress about conditions in Mississippi. She had been, when she was so badly beaten, they took her to a local hospital, and they sterilized her without her permission. So she never had children. She made everybody else's kid her kid. She had lots of kids, but they were not her biological children. Vernon Delaware was a very successful businessman. He was kind of this unusual person who was able to thrive and had a couple of sawmills and businesses. But he too is going to end up murdered. And Vernon Delaware is going to be the one person whose death causes Sam Bowers to, in I think 1998, all those years later, be put in prison. Sam Bowers, the leader of the KKK, Imperial Wizard, who had the power to say, this person is to be executed, that person is to be executed. Okay, this is where we connect to Kansas a little bit. On July 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in case you think, what's the importance of laws? What do they mean anyway? I would say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 of us in this room were benefited incredibly from the Civil Rights Act, at least 5 of us. Because the Civil Rights Act said you could not discriminate based on your religion, your color, your national origin, your gender, and later they added age and they added disability. In later years, they added those things to it. It's an incredible piece of legislation. But there is one thing missing from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It said nothing about protecting your right to vote or to register people to vote. So think about those young people doing this very dangerous work in Mississippi. They're frustrated that the Civil Rights Act, that everybody's hailing as an incredibly progressive piece of legislation, leaves out voting and leaves out protecting their right to vote. Okay, so there was a Kansas connection. When Johnson signed this into law, that very same day, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, sent a group of high-level people to Mississippi to try to find out what had happened to these 3 young men who've disappeared. And among them was the leader of the civil rights movement in Kansas, a person who should be in every textbook, a young lawyer in his mid-20s named Chester I. Lewis, Jr., incredible man. You want to do your report from school if you have an opportunity, do it on Chester Lewis. He's really an amazing person. Chester Lewis was top of his class at KU Law School. He was a veteran. He served in Okinawa. He came from an educated family. He had everything going for him. And he thought, before going to Mississippi, that all he had to do is get a law like the Civil Rights Act that says you can't discriminate based on race, national origin, etc., in hiring, firing, education, public accommodations. If you had a law like that passed, then everybody would be each person for themselves. Everybody would be equal. And he went to Mississippi, and he went around Mississippi with this delegation of people from the National UCC, all of whom were lawyers or doctors or some other high profession. And what they found was everywhere they went in Mississippi, the state troopers had their guns pointed right at them. They were harassed, they were spit upon. It made not a whit of difference that they were highly credentialed, highly educated people. And he came back home and he was really depressed. And after a time, it changed the way that he approached doing civil rights work. He said, it's not enough just to have the rights. We have to deal with economics, we have to deal with raising people, and caring about people who are at the bottom of it, who are the most marginalized in our society. We have to care about them. So he's echoing about Moses, right? Saying, people know the solutions to their problems. They know. If the poor people know what they need to get out of poverty. But you just have to ask and work with them and give them those tools. Okay, next. The second mission for the summer was setting up freedom schools. We've already mentioned that. And they had 36 schools a month into their work. They had 36 schools across Mississippi with children and adults. That was twice the number they had planned to build. They did reading and writing, Black history, math, civil rights, the history of the civil rights movement. They did plays, they did art, they did dance, they learned French and Spanish. They compared the lives of poor whites and the lives of poor blacks to try to teach kids that poverty was a huge part of the issue, right? And they had notes, they had prepared a whole curriculum, notes on teaching. The students wrote newspapers at each of these schools. I mean, think about it. I mean, that may seem like it's not much, but in 1964, there were no high schools. If you were black, you had no high schools in Mississippi. You didn't get past 8th grade. You were lucky to get to 8th grade. 2,000 people participated in these freedom schools. And at the end of the summer, they had a freedom school convention. And we'll look at that in just a second. It lasted 3 days. Let's look at the picture. 3 days, and the whole thing was run by students. They planned the whole 3-day convention and organized it. Again, reflecting what Moses was teaching. Understand you have the power to change your situation, right? And other people can help you, but we need to find out what you think works. Okay. They trained their teachers. Again, notice the group. Notice how young they are. They're learning about how to teach in Mississippi. Third thing was these community centers, and they set up 13 of them with libraries, classes, etc. Public health classes, hygiene classes, literacy, childcare was provided, and job training. They set up a free Southern theater so that they performed around Mississippi in black communities, putting on plays, and often plays written by African American playwrights whose stuff was not getting much play in the mainstream media, but it's getting played in Mississippi. It's getting performed. Folk singers. I don't know if anybody here knows the name Pete Seeger. You know the name Pete Seeger? Pete Seeger is the person who is credited with bringing We Shall Overcome into the movement, introducing it to some of the people in the movement. He was a very prominent singer. All of these people were Julius Lester, Judy Collins, the actress Shirley MacLaine was involved, Harry Belafonte, and Sidney Poitier. Poitier was the first black actor to win an Oscar for the Oscars for Best Actor. They came to Mississippi. They came to Greenwood, Mississippi. And they brought $60,000 of their personal money. Now this is 1964, so you have to multiply by probably 200 to get to what that's would be worth today. And they were actually chased by the Klan. These prominent actors were chased by the Klan, and they barely made it into the black area of town. But a lot of folks were supporting what was going on here. This is one of the community centers, and you see the libraries. The kids were just amazed to have access to books. It was like, oh my gosh, this is transformative to have access to books. So what was the Klan and the White Citizens Council, what were they doing to the community centers? Remember? Burning them, right? Burn them, you burn the books. You keep people from having education. Okay, next. Their final effort was to create a parallel integrated political party and to ask to be seated at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1964. Now, 1964 was the year that we had a person running for president who was from Arizona named Barry Goldwater, who sounds, if you read his writings and you read his book, it's very similar to a lot of what the extremes of the Republican Party are saying today. Very similar. And except that it's something add to it anti-communism, because we were in the middle of the Cold War. Lyndon Johnson was a Southerner from Texas, but he had his first job was teaching in a little backwoods school, working with Hispanic kids who were poor. And they had no books, they barely had paper, and he was so impressed by that. He realized how unequal a society we live in. And so he had this passion, even though he was from Texas, he's a white Southerner, he's grown up among all of this hatred and racism, and he still has this passion. And we'll see that passion had to kind of live with his political desire to be president again, right? So, okay. So, the Freedom Volunteers are walking the state of Mississippi collecting signatures on a petition that says, we can't get into our own Democratic Party, they won't let us in. So we're forming an integrated political party. The president of our political party is black, the vice president is white. We have black and white members of our political party. And we want you, the National Democratic Party, to accept us and let us be seated in place of the regular, what they call the regular Democratic Party. And they were holding precinct meetings. They signed up something like 84,000 people. I mean, imagine that. This is like 44 days working in Mississippi. And they got Belafonte and Sidney Poitier to pay for the buses to take these delegates from Mississippi by bus to Atlantic City, New Jersey for the convention. Okay, let's go. This is the convention. You see Lyndon Johnson, the biggest picture on either side of the stage? That's the civil rights president. That's that Texan that I was telling you about. And the button, one man, one vote, Freedom Democratic Party, FDP, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The button is just superimposed. It wasn't actually on the screen or there. But look at that crowd. So we had 64 Mississippians who at the end of the summer take the bus to Atlantic City. Bob Moses said we really would like to get 400,000 people signed up for a new political party. They got 63,000 signed up. They had 84,000 on other petitions, but they had 63,000 signed up to support this new political party, which is still quite a few people. 68 delegates went to, after 64, 68 delegates went to Atlantic City. 4 of them were white. I say Euro-American because I think it's a better way to word it. If you're European American, you're Asian American, you're African American, you're Latin American, Euro-American. The state officials denied them the charter for their being the political party that would represent Mississippi. And this is the state of Mississippi. And they also denied them the right to use the word democratic. They said, yeah, democratic. You're not a Democratic Party, we're the Democratic Party. They were firebound, arrested, and beaten before they left Mississippi. But when they got to Atlantic City, 25 Democratic congresspeople and celebrities joined them. Aaron Henry, the president, met with all state delegations and passed out booklets with 24 legal precedents for their challenge to the Mississippi regular Democrats. They did everything right. They had lawyers working with them to make sure their paperwork was completely accurate. Mrs. Hamer down the bottom, Fannie Lou Hamer, testified to the Credentials Committee. And she said, I want to tell you what it's like to be black in Mississippi. And she went through telling of everything that she had experienced because of her desire to vote. Just because of her desire to vote. Aaron Henry, the president, was also speaking to the Credentials Committee. They towed behind the bus a facsimile of the car the three young men had been riding in the night they were seized. August 4th, the bodies of the three young men were found, buried in a dam. They'd been beaten and murdered. And the car was found. But by this time they had this facsimile car that they were bringing with them. The other car was too messed up. Okay. In Mississippi, the Klan came out in force while they were gone, while the delegates were up in Atlantic City, walking the streets, wearing their hoods. And you see that there were women's groups in the Klan as well. They were arresting people trying to vote, which you see in the second picture. And meanwhile, up in Atlantic City, the 68 people that have come from Mississippi, representing the Freedom Democratic Party, are waiting to hear what's going to happen. And they're waiting on the boardwalk in Atlantic City, and it's raining. Imagine sitting there in the rain, waiting to hear if you're going to get, after all you've done, registering all these 63,000 people, and getting them, getting your party formed and doing all the legal work to get a truly representative party. So let's go to the next. So what happened? A compromise was engineered. And this is where I said the president, the civil rights president, also was desperate to be elected. He was truly a civil rights president, but he was also truly afraid that Barry Goldwater was going to defeat him. And he thought if there's too much talk about civil rights, if we get this Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party a lot of attention, the white South, which is solidly Democratic, will walk out of the convention. I won't have those white Southern voters to vote for me. Do you understand? Because the Democratic Party was the party of the South at this time. Okay, so he says to a man named, a senator named Hubert Humphrey, I want you to work out a compromise with the Freedom Democrats. The lawyer, Joseph Rao, of the Mississippi Freedom Democrats, was also the lawyer for the United Auto Workers. And Joseph Rao was told, you've got to work out a compromise, or you will not represent the auto workers, by Walter Luther, the president of the Auto Workers Union. Okay? Other delegates from other states gave the Mississippi Freedom Democrats their passes to go into the convention and sit on the floor. Now imagine the drama of this. All these delegates, these 68 people, being passed it. Okay, you're from Minnesota, you're from Maine, you pass your credentials and you say, you take my seat in the convention. Imagine that. Very high drama. Okay, but they were removed from the convention. And the regular, the all-white, what so-called regular Democrats weren't going to support LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, anyway. He's the one that got the Civil Rights Act passed. He's the one that talks about, we will overcome, we must all overcome. So they walked out of the convention. The Mississippi seats are empty. But the compromise that LBJ has had Hubert Humphrey work out with the lawyer, Joseph Rao, says the Mississippi Freedom Democrats will get 2 seats and the 66 other Mississippi Freedom Democrats will not have any representation, any voice. Mrs. Hamer says, we didn't come all the way from Mississippi. We didn't lose our jobs, get beaten nearly to death for the right to vote, and sit on a bus. I mean, save the money to keep this work going, bring all these volunteers down to Mississippi, do all of this, risk our lives, lose all these people who were murdered. We didn't do this for 2 measly seats at this convention. I want you to get the drama of this moment. Imagine how you would feel if you believed the right to vote was going to be the answer. And then your own president in the party that is the only party in your part of the country betrays you. They turned around, got back on the buses, went back to Mississippi. And it was an extremely disillusioning time and a moment that changed history, because all of these young volunteers now had an experience of government is not trustworthy. Even government that passes the Civil Rights Act, if they think it's going to help their political gain goals, they'll sell you out. Can you imagine the disillusionment? Okay, let's go to the next. Then the election comes in November. What do you notice about this slide? Tell me what you see. The South Coast Republican, the solidly Democratic South goes for Goldwater. What about the rest of the country except for Goldwater's own state? It's all for LBJ, the civil rights president. It's the largest landslide in U.S. history for a president. Did he need to be so worried? Did he need to be so dismissive of the Mississippi Freedom Democrats? Probably not. He won overwhelmingly. Look at the popular vote, 61%, that's incredibly high. And the electoral vote, over 90% of the electoral college vote. LBJ wins overwhelmingly. Okay. This same year, LBJ had started the war on poverty, and a lot of what it had done was to take the same message that Bob Moses was telling these young students in Mississippi, the message that you need to let poor people identify what they need. They have to be involved. And I think this is a wisdom that the war on poverty brought that we tend to forget today. We've been forgetting it for all the decades since then. And we think, we know best. Whoever has the degrees behind their name knows best. Not whoever has actually lived what it's like to live in poverty in America. We don't pay much attention to that anymore. But we did get a war on poverty, which brought programs like Head Start, Meals on Wheels came out of the war on poverty, food stamps eventually came out of the war on poverty, the ability to get a lawyer if you had no money to pay for one. There were so many programs that were part of this. There were in local communities, cities like Wichita, and I'm sure here in Independence, you had anti-poverty commissions set up. And the law required that poor people sit on those commissions. Not the majority of the seats, but substantial minority, so that there would be that voice telling folks what is needed. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's a really, really different approach than we have today. Another thing that happened in 1964 is 1,000 young people discovered the police state that was Mississippi, thinking, good night, I thought this was America. I didn't think people treated people the way they do in Mississippi. And they experienced that of the South, and they were profoundly changed, and many of them profoundly disillusioned. They saw the contradictions between political gain versus what is right. And they saw how often politicians get pulled into political gain rather than what's right. Bob Moses, for example, what happened to him? Well, he changed his name. He left the United States for 8 years. This is a guy who had dropped out of the Harvard PhD program, who had taught in inner city schools in New York City, to come to Mississippi, dropped out of the Harvard program to come to Mississippi. And now he's so disillusioned. He changes his name, goes by Robert Parrish, and he moves to Africa and just tries to get as far as he can from the civil rights field, from all this chaos in American life. And he eventually completes that PhD. And this is when he's being given his PhD. Looks a little different, white beard, white hair. You can see it's a long time later. 80 of the volunteers stayed in Mississippi and kept up this work out of 1,000. Most of them went back to their colleges, but 80 stayed. Okay. But a lot of them were very disillusioned. And they weren't ripe for the anti-war movement that followed within a year and a half as the Vietnam War, as U.S. troops were committed to fight in Vietnam. They were ready, they were already disillusioned. They were ready to say, why are you sending your young people to Vietnam? What are we getting from it? What does it have to do with our country? And as we know, that changed life in America profoundly. So what about progress? How do we assess it? Well, by the end of 1965, 60% of Mississippi's African-American population was registered to vote. 60. How much was it in 1964? 6.7%, right? So this is a whole lot more people, right? You're okay, you're fine. By 1972, it was up to 67%. The state passed laws to try to limit black power. They said that county and city elections would all be held at large. So if you had a community that was 99% black, they were up against the whole, they all voted for the same people that all the rest of the white communities voted for. So you didn't have a chance to have somebody who could be elected to represent your community. The state tried to fight this. They had a law that said you had 10 times as many signatures to get something on the ballot, to get a person's name on the ballot. And they gerrymandered the districts in the Delta, the black region, the predominantly black region. However, a young woman who had been part of Freedom Summer, young African-American woman named Unita Blackwell, became the first black female mayor of a Mississippi town in 1977. So it's like, there's some really good stuff that came out of it. Like, even up against all the rest of this that was happening. Since 1964, Mississippi has voted Republican steadily, all but one election. The Delta in 1979 became one congressional district. And Mike Espy, who became Secretary of Agriculture under Clinton and then was killed in a plane crash, an African-American congressman from Mississippi, he became the first black congressman from Mississippi in 1986, since the end of the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. And he was an amazing man, but then he was killed in a plane crash. Towns with black mayors are the very same towns that were the centers of Freedom Summer. If you look at a map and you see the towns that elected black mayors, they just match perfectly to where the Freedom Summer people were. In 1996, the only woman to head the Freedom Summer project, Muriel Tillinghast, was Ralph Nader's vice presidential candidate, 1996. And look at the people who became major politicians, names that I hope you've all known, I've all heard of, who were in Freedom Summer. Barry Frank from Massachusetts, openly gay congressman who has been extremely progressive, and he's no longer in Congress, but he did a tremendous job. Marion Wright Edelman, who started the Children's Defense Fund in Washington, D.C., which is an incredible organization, working for the welfare of children, all children. Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's the first and so far the only person who has a non-voting seat in Congress representing Washington, D.C. Harold Ickes, who ran Hillary Clinton's campaigns for the Senate and for president in 2008. Marion Barry, who died recently, who was the mayor of D.C., Washington, D.C. Charlie Kyle, Portland Cox, Cynthia Washington, Adam Hochschild, who's written numerous books that I use when I teach about Africa, because I teach African history. He's written King Leopold's Ghost, which was a national prize winner, about the Congo. It's an incredibly wonderful book. But all of this is just a short list of the people who went to Freedom Summer, and it changed their lives, and they became lifelong activists. And if you go to Mississippi today, you see these historic markers. What was then a very big secret is now a historical marker. This is where these activists, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, who had come here to investigate the burning of Mount Zion Church, were murdered. Victims of a Klan conspiracy. But the man who ordered their murder was never charged. Sam Bowers. Right? Next. And you have a historical marker to Vernon Dahmer. Do you remember the man we saw early on? Light-skinned, very light-skinned man, was a businessman in Mississippi, and who was murdered, again, by Sam Bowers and the KKK of Mississippi. The picture on the left is a picnic right at the beginning of Freedom Summer that he had on his farm, on his land, for the volunteers, to try to give them a sense that they were not walking into the lion's den, although they really were walking into the lion's den. Sam Bowers was convicted in 1998, 34 years later. 34 years later, for murdering Vernon Dahmer. And this is the house, the Dahmer's house, completely burned up. And he stood in the doorway and got his family out the back. He's got a gun to hold people off who were coming to burn his house, and he's with his family inside. And they got out, and he didn't. Justice came late in Mississippi. In 1994, Byron de Beckwith was convicted for assassinating the NAACP president of Mississippi State NAACP, Medgar Evers, and he died in prison. In 1998, Bowers was convicted of firebombing Dahmer's house, and he died in prison. In 2001, Thomas Blanton was convicted for murdering the kids at the 16th Street Birmingham Baptist Church in 1963, the 4 girls who were attending Sunday school. And in 2003, Ernest Oppitz, a reputed Klansman, was convicted of killing the black sharecropper as part of a plot to assassinate Martin Luther King by luring him to come into southern Mississippi. Okay. Since 1989, authorities in Mississippi and 5 other states have re-examined 23 killings from the Civil Rights era and made 27 arrests, leading to 21 convictions, 2 acquittals, and 1 mistrial. So it's justice coming, but very late. But nevertheless, these southern communities are saying, we can't just say without a thing. You know, it was a long time ago, these people are old now. If we don't punish the people who did these crimes, it gives permission to say it's okay. What they did was okay. They need to be prosecuted. These are a few resources you might be interested in. The theaters are going to be showing a film on the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers by the second man, Sandy Nelson. If you listen to public television, or public radio, or watch public television, you probably have heard him interviewed. And I really strongly recommend you go see it. And he did one that you can also see online. It's on YouTube. It's on Freedom Summer. It's a terrific film, just an amazing film. It was done last year for the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer. And then there was a conference at Tougaloo College last summer in Jackson, Mississippi, which brought all these, not all, but hundreds of people who had been Freedom Summer volunteers to Jackson, Mississippi. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be a fly on the wall and hear their stories? Just amazing. Okay, I think that's it. Is there one more? Okay, no problem. A couple more. And I'll be glad to, this is being taped, so it'll be available for school teachers or for, if you want to show it to a club you belong to or whatever. So I'd encourage you to think about that. Okay, let's go to the next. And I want to just leave with this thought. 1,000 young college students joined young people who were already working in Mississippi for that summer of 1964. And they had disagreements. They were not all together of one mind. Did they because they were mostly white, did they empower or disempower local people? And there's argument about that. There are people that say they didn't pay enough attention to Bob Moses' message, that you have to invite people to tell their story, that you have to get people to name what they need. You cannot supply that information because you've never walked in their shoes. You've never lived their lives. Did they bring about change? Because violence continued in 1965 when there was a 3-month-long effort to try to register voters in Alabama and Selma, which we commemorated this year as the 50th anniversary of the Selma March. You may remember that. Violence continued. More people died. There were more martyrs to the movement. And in 66 and 67, there was a lot of frustration in urban communities with the way police were treating young black men. And there were eruptions of conflict between police and crowds of young men. There was a lot of violence that still continued. Did they open up the National Democratic Party? Well, yes, they did. The National Democratic Party, the very next election, had quotas. They said, our party will say we will have women and we will have people of different ethnicities who will represent our party. You can't just send an all-white, all-male delegation from Mississippi anymore. It's got to be mixed. Of course, by this time, Mississippi is Republican, right? All Republican. How many people participated? How many freedom schools were bombed? How many community centers were bombed? We don't know. I mean, the data is very sketchy because so many of the records were lost. But we know it was sizable. Go to the next one. Okay, I wanted to end with reading you just a little, we have time? Okay. I wanted to just read you a little bit from a book that I put my heart into. Whoa, don't lean on the podium, Gretchen, don't do that. Okay, sorry, I'll move over here. Then I'm not on the camera anyway. This book is named for a fictional town in Mississippi, maybe Crossings, Mississippi. And the first 100 pages are set in the 1960s and follow the course of 3 families, black families and white families, who are shaped and reshaped by the civil rights movement that goes through Nashville, Tennessee, and then into other parts of the South, parts of the movement we haven't talked about tonight. But there is a section that is about Freedom Summer. And I think I said at the beginning that my friend who was there thought it was very accurate. So I want to read to you just a little bit of this description. Mississippi, like the rest of the South, was basically a one-party state. Since the end of Reconstruction 80 years ago, Republicans have been scarcer than snow in this part of the world. Participation in the Democratic Party was the only game in town if you wanted to access political power. But black people were denied participation in the openly white supremacist Democratic Party. That exclusion produced this new strategy, and I'm not going to, you know what the strategy is, to form a political party. And to collect all these signatures, 35,000 signatures a week, so that they could go and make the National Party accept them. So we're talking here about 2 characters, both African American, one from the north, or one from New York City named Reggie, and one from Nashville, Tennessee named Edward. These 2 young men have been assigned the job of collecting signatures for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Sometimes when they felt especially daring, they entered the cotton fields and approached the laborers to persuade them to join, to sign. That had become increasingly risky and expensive after the state legislature raised the fines for trespassing to $500. More often they went door to door at dawn before the pickers headed off the fields. And then during the day they worked the community centers that Freedom Summer volunteers had set up, ending up at the churches in the evening. It was tough work. Mississippi's secret intelligence organization, the Sovereignty Commission, spied on the volunteers, tapped their phones, and sent paid informers to cuddle up to the civil rights workers and report on their activities. Judging by the increase in violence during July, Edward is from Tennessee, from Nashville. Edward calculated that the whites in power must be worried about the parallel political party strategy. Every time there was a precinct meeting, white men turned up, sitting in their cars, chewing tobacco, and pointing their rifles at any black or white person entering the local Freedom House. In half a dozen towns, the Freedom Houses were firebombed, and those not firebombed had been raided. On this particular day, Edward and Reggie had stayed too long at an AV church in Edibena, talking up the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Day was already headed for China when they began driving home. Reggie placed the petitions they had gathered signatures on in the trunk of the car so they could drive fast with the windows down in this clammy night. And Edward did drive fast, taking those country roads at close to 90, determined to outrun any night riders. Once they reached the black community where they were living, they would probably be safe, but they still had a ways to go. The moonless night came on suddenly, like Indian ink spilling over them, obliterating landmarks. When he glanced at Reggie, Edward could make out only a dark, featureless presence in the passenger seat, and it spooked him. Edward was trying to drive without headlights so as not to attract attention, but after skidding off the side of the road a couple of times, he compromised and put on his parking lights. Behind them, they saw small, glowing dots of light, steadily growing larger. Headlights, surely. 2 cars trailing them. He pressed his foot on the accelerator, and the beat-up old Chevy labored to pick up speed. Now another light penetrated the darkness, throwing light around the road from its perch atop the police car, causing him to wince as its path momentarily found his staring eyes. Reggie was speaking to him in a quiet voice. "We're only a few blocks from home. Lay on the horn and keep going. If we have to pull over, I think we should run for it. Make sure your door is locked and the window up." Panicked, Edward did as he was told. The shrill, hollow sound of the horn split the darkness, cutting through the black sky like a hatchet. They could sense more than see activity ahead of them as the men of their community came out onto their porches to investigate what was causing the honking. The car with the flashing light came up beside Edward. 2 deputies in uniforms, guns ready, yelled at him to pull over. Seeing no other option, he slowed the car and eased it to the right side of the road, where it leaned precariously into the ditch on the passenger side. "Now, come on, out my side." Reggie flung open the door and leapt from the vehicle. Edward, adrenaline pumping, followed him. They could hear the deputies talking as they approached the car, and they could see circles of white circles turning into figure 8s as their flashlights bobbed with each step. Edward and Reggie crouched beside the fender until they saw a flashlight scanning the car. Then they took off, running toward those porches that they could barely make out up ahead. Shots sang out, but they kept running. "This way, we're almost here. Go round back. We've got you covered." The voice was familiar, and they did as it directed them. They had reached the last house on Cornflower Road, the beginning of the community of Paul's Bend. Several other houses stood in a flanking formation. Edward imagined the backs of the houses defiantly mooning the cars of the deputies as the searchlight hit them. The car he and Reggie had abandoned was eerily illuminated by the still circling searchlight. Otherwise, all was darkness. He was breathless and shaking as they rounded the corner and collapsed against the side wall of the first house they reached. For a moment, he thought, stricken with guilt, what would Mama do if he died here in Mississippi? He could make out voices, the deputies conferring, low and incomprehensible. He heard the sound of splintering glass. One of them must have broken a window to open the driver's door. He heard the familiar sputtering of the Chevy's tinted spark plugs, long overdue for replacement. Then, finally, ignition, followed by the grinding of gears. He guessed they must be rocking the car forward and back, trying to get it out of the ditch. After a time, the two other cars started up. The searchlight disappeared, and he heard the sound of tires kicking up gravel and dirt. Which way were they going? The sound quieted. They must not be coming after us, he whispered to Reggie. Just a little bit. Cautiously, they both stood, peeked around the house, and when they could make out only red taillights in the distance, they walked around to the front stoop. A well-built, middle-aged man wearing an army camouflage t-shirt stood on the stoop, holding a rifle. Come on in. You're not in danger now. He held open the screen door and ushered them into the front room. Sit down a while, catch your breath. Why didn't they come after us? Reggie asked. There was two of them, and when they shined their light over here, they could make out a number of us standing on our porches with our rifles trained on them. Didn't want to mess with us, is my guess. What will they do with our car? Impound it, make you pay $500 to get it back, then fine whoever picks it up for reckless driving and speeding. Another $250 and $400. My guess is you're looking at $1,150 before you see that car again. Reggie stood and began to pace. His face looked grim. We have to get the car back, or at least get to it tonight before they go over it. I put all the petitions in the trunk. Remember? If they get those petitions, they'll have the names and addresses of all the folk who have signed up, and those people will be targets. Edward, we've got to find out where they put the car and retrieve the petitions. How can we find the car in this dark? Edward shifted from relief and elation at being safe to terror at the thought that they would be exposing the 100 people they had enlisted to sign up for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to reprisals. The man he thought of as his rescuer was speaking, taking time with his words. He thought it unlikely the deputies would take the car far tonight. Probably they'd just park it at the nearest side road and then return in the morning to go over it. If they were really careful, they might locate it tonight while the deputies were celebrating frightening those commies. When Reggie and Edward insisted on going to find the car right away, the closed expression on their host's face changed. I ain't had much interest in what you've been doing here, he said. This voter registration business, that political party, I've been saying it'll only bring trouble to us. But if you boys is willing to risk your lives to go find that car right now and get back all them people's names and addresses, well, I guess I ought to be willing to risk my own ass. Make you a deal. You get back here in one piece with those papers, and I'll sign up myself.
What's the name of that book?
This is a new novel that I just had come out 4 weeks ago that I wrote called Maybe Crossings. And it'll be on Amazon. I just put it on Amazon. Our publisher just put it on Amazon yesterday. But I brought copies along, it's $15. And what I was trying to do in this novel was to talk about how the civil rights movement changed the generation that were involved, but then how their children's generation really had to kind of reinvent ideas about race, sexuality, family, community. It's very different, the generation that followed of those same people. And so the first 100 pages are set in the 60s, and then it goes up to 2003, and the whole rest of the book is those same three families with their children's generation and the older generation. And the secrets that we don't tell each other, even our closest family members sometimes, and the way that they have a biracial child, girl, who's now an adult, the way that she and the man she loves have to negotiate what they think about race and sexuality and commitment. Who wants to make commitment? And family, right? So anyway, I have it here if anybody wants one. Any questions or comments? Reactions? Was this new material for you, or did you know this? Most of what we're learning tonight.
Some was new and some was refreshing,
Some was new and some was,
what we'd already learned.
Were you want to say something? Did you want to say something?
No, it is pretty much, you know, we only know like maybe a little bit mentioned in history.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm from Georgia, and we're a military state, so that's probably why they were a little bit,
You were living on bases.
well, military towns,
Uh-huh.
and they're a little bit better integrated than a lot of, I didn't see any problems too much when I was growing up. But our also, I've told this before, our state was one of the earlier states to integrate in the South. Everybody thought it was in '63. That's what we thought, but everybody else, just about every state was 73. So.
Well, you mean school segregation?
Yeah.
Schools were integrated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our schools did it in '63.
I mean, there was still a lot of hostile activity going on in places like, I had a minute ago now, Albany, Georgia. There was a major campaign in Albany. And so but yes, there were places like Atlanta.
I remember the one in Alabama, the bus. That was
Yeah.
in my head.
The Freedom Bus, and the bus was burning,
Yeah.
being attacked riding through the South with blacks and whites sitting together, and that was '61.
And I also remember the kids that got killed in
Yeah.
Mississippi.
Anybody, any other comments?
I came in late, so I didn't get to hear a lot. We were at another function, but this is my hometown, and I was a high school senior in 1962.
Can you speak a little louder?
I was a high school senior in 1962. We had one incident where we had blacks lining the entryway to the center on the backside, coming from the parking lot. I don't remember the occasion and why they were upset. There had been fights. I'm sure it was about the time that,
In '62?
yes, that integration was happening. I had black friends, and so I didn't think much about it. I came in late for some reason from lunch, later than I usually did. I can't remember if I was working at that time at the hamburger stand, the Dairy Queen at the time or not. But I came in and walked through the gauntlet of young men, mostly blacks, at that time, and spoke to people that I knew, as I came in, and I knew it was a tense situation, but I had no idea that there had been incidents that had happened that made it a really tense situation. But having lived through that, when I came back to independence, we came back in 1973, and there was a black sit-down in the Board of Education's office, again, for something that had happened. And Independence was in the headlines for being called the hellhole of Southeast Kansas. So that will give you a little flavor of what was happening here. I became the public relations person, in 1973 for the USD 446 and was in that position for 15 years. Worked with Bob Wesley, a black gentleman on the board that served at the time. All I saw was respect on both sides. I was not actually seeing or experiencing bad circumstances, but I was hearing about a few. I don't think it was as bad as people
Yeah,
say.
let me comment on that, because my first book is on the civil rights movement in Wichita and the Midwest in general. And what I found was, like for school segregation, it's probably much like Georgia. It depended on which city you lived in. Like there were cities like Topeka, Lawrence, and Wichita who had segregated schools all the way up to through 1971. And they kept redrawing the boundary lines to make sure that neighborhoods that were predominantly black went to one school, and the schools that had already looked like they were going to integrate, they would change the boundary lines so that they would send the white kids to a different school and the black kids to a different school. But then there were, the majority of towns in Kansas weren't segregated. They didn't segregate their, it was their choice, and oftentimes it depended on the economics of the situation, and it didn't make sense to try to build a whole separate school. If you did, you had small communities, so it was very, very mixed, and it was the same way in parts of the South. There were southern places like Richmond, Virginia, that they heard the Supreme Court ruling in 1954, and they made plans and integrated their schools. But then there were the vast majority of southern cities that did not, that fought it intensely. So, yeah, Kansas is an aberration because it's similar in, I suppose every place has, it's not the same anywhere. In each state there are the exceptions to the rule. And independence made them one.
And in Independence, in the late 50s and early 60s, it was an integrated, segregated school. The races went to school together, but there was a black basketball team and a white basketball team. There's information back here. A black cheerleading team, a white cheerleading team, a black queen of the basketball.
So they were in the same school?
They were in the same school. And there were separate swimming pools at Riverside Park. So, it's interesting how on the surface, there was integration as far as the community was concerned, appeared to be. But also during that time, when we did the African American exhibit last year, we had interviews with some of our black people that talked about how they were treated in the drugstores in the 60s and not served. And that spilled over onto other races. A black person would go into Woolworths with a Mexican, and they were both asked to leave.
Both of them were.
They were both asked to leave, the black and the Mexican.
Whereas in Wichita, there was discrimination against Mexicans, but it was not anywhere near as extreme.
Now Chanute, we found, was very discriminatory toward Mexicans. And blacks, but particularly Mexicans.
I'll try to speak up, but I just taught the last 2 years in Longton, Kansas, which is his hometown. The first year I was there, I don't remember any black students there. And something came up from one of the novels we read in the English class I was teaching. And students commented that they had never had a friend that was black. They'd never gone to school with a black student. The next year I had 4 at least black students and 1 Mexican, 1 Hispanic, and I think 1 or 2 Asian. But it's interesting because a lot of the families that came were mixed racial families, and these families were related to some of those in the school. And one of the students, I thought he was Hispanic, but he said he was black, came from Wichita, and he commented about how poorly he was treated in Wichita and how he loved Longton because he was treated like a person.
I think integration is a complex construct. And the more, it seems to me, the more you try to explain the elements of integration, the more obvious integration becomes, to the extent that it almost drives a segregation, if that makes any sense. Identifying the parts seems to separate the parts, which while we try to integrate, sometimes I think that the effort in itself, because we are focused on segregation, it itself destroys itself.
I think in some respects, as we become much, is this still on? Yeah. I think as we become a much more diverse society, which, you know, we're going to be majority minority within the next 10 years or so.
Right.
And I think, but I have children. I have a daughter who is Korean American, and her children, she's married a Filipino American, and so my grandchildren are Filipino, Korean, and Euro American, and they have had similar. They have been discriminated against. I mean, they don't. It's not something they look for or they talk about readily.
Right.
But what it's done is it's brought them so they have friends who are Vietnamese, friends who are Mexican, friends who are African American. It's like there's a sort of sense of we're all in this together. You know, we all have, and it's not a we're against you. It's just, you know, we all know what it's like to be treated differently, and we know. I mean, I've done some work this summer. I've been reading a little bit about racial perceptions, and one of the things I thought was fascinating. I had done a lot of work in the Black community in Wichita, and I was given an award this summer, and I went to the banquet, and the same thing happened at the banquet to me that I have seen happen in reverse situations, which is that being in a predominantly one race community and being of another race in that situation, people didn't recognize me. You know, and I would wait, hi, how are you? And I know everybody, I know all these people. But it wasn't until they actually got really up close that they saw that, that's Gretchen, you know, how are you, you know? But, and the same thing happens in reverse all the time. You know, to African American kids in a school that's predominantly white, teachers often say, you know, get them confused. Well, they don't look at all alike, you know, but they, you know, do you know what I'm talking about? We have such a long ways to go, and I think that the way that we're going to get there is to make friends and to socialize, and, you know, we have to really know each other and, you know, spend time together so that it isn't that you see everybody as
Different.
one mass. You know, you see, this is my friend Joe, and this is my sister, you know, my quote-unquote sister, Miriam, whatever.
Well, I'm earlier than this. I grew up in Independence. I grew up in a rural area, and when I came to high school here, I found that the country kids were kind of discriminated against, and we were, as a general rule, poorer, and so we brought our lunch and sat on the bleacher tables in the gym to eat. And two of my very best friends in high school were black girls, and we were really quite close. And then in junior college, I went to, well, it was JUCO instead of ICC, or I graduated there in 42. And I know we had Phi Theta Kappa, and that year it was unusual because that was the first time a black girl was a black student was accepted into that society there. But
That's really interesting.
yes,
Yeah.
but I didn't sense the discrimination as much as probably if I lived right here.
There's been a lot of historical research, even going back to the American Revolution, And what they found is that, what some scholars have found is that blacks and whites were very mixed in the same social class. We've been kind of taught, oh, the Klan was all these, poor whites. No, the Klan was bankers, and it was, newspaper editors, and it was prominent people were involved in the Klan. It wasn't, and what they've found in studying like Virginia in the early colonial, well, at the end of the colonial period, and in the early 19th century, that if you go into the areas of Richmond, for example, that were low-income areas, you had black and white families residing together in close, friends, taking care of each other's house, children, dogs, whatever, which is very interesting because historians are changing the way they're understanding.
I'd like to mention another thing. A couple of things, actually. My church is a Presbyterian church here in Independence, which was mostly white folks all the way I can remember growing up in Caucasians. And I remember wanting to invite one of my girlfriends to church. And my mother said, that's fine, you're welcome to invite her. But she said, I want you to realize that she might not be comfortable coming. So that I wouldn't be hurt. She wanted me to realize that. And so I talked with her and I told her, what my mother had said, be sure and tell your family that our church is all white. But I said, they're nice people and I think you'll be treated well. And she chose not to come, so I never found out how they treat her. Another thing I wanted to mention was that, I would also mention that, there are a number of black churches. And I think in one of the books, Ken Brown maybe had, or maybe another book, there's comments about the black churches in Independence. If you're interested, there's some history there.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm not sure who would be the right party, but my husband might know some of those because of that black discussion at the museum. I also wanted to mention there was an element of the Ku Klux Klan here when my father was young, and I know that he thought it was not what it turned out to be. He went to one meeting, saw quickly what it was, and quickly got out of it. And I think it more or less dissolved. I think it was partially a neo-de instigated grouping, I don't know. But I just thought I'd mention that. It's interesting how the foundation of a town influences the racial factor. And having the Hispanics and the blacks and the Indian families and the Germans come into the museum and talk about their settlements in the location here really brought out a lot of things to me that I hadn't heard of before. It was fascinating.
And we were very, I broke my kneecap this summer, so I'm still recovering from my. Now, I was going to say that we're very diverse. We think